it is. Beautiful. So I think I've heard the bells ring outside. So are we ready to get started?
I'm ready.
All right. So Dr. Rico Chapman, he's going to talk to us about establishing the Center for Africana Digital Humanities at Clark-Atlanta University.
Thank you. We founded the center in 2020, just prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, and it serves as an ideation space for faculty and students to develop research projects that incorporate computational tools in humanities research. But I'll take this lightning talk to describe what we mean by Africana Digital Humanities. And Africana Digital Humanities grows out of Africana studies, as well as the Du Boisian legacy of interdisciplinary collaborative research. Africana DH studies the Black experience from various disciplinary lenses using digital and computational tools. Though many of the tools originate in the global North, Africana DH claims African ancestral communicative technology as its true early beginnings, where healing, recovery, and fulfillment of purpose was its primary role, as opposed to industrial, commercial, and military technology uses as found in the West. African ancestral communicative technology recognizes the role of spirit as a technological concept, while also informing technology. Some of these technologies were embedded within the people themselves as griots, healers, and conduits of information from early lineages meant to serve the individual and community. Africana DH centers Blackness and is less about the computational tools and more so the epistemology that connects an African identity with technology. Africana DH goes further by acknowledging that the process of knowledge recovery and production happens before digitization and computation, allowing communities to be empowered regardless of technological prowess. Africana Digital Humanities is the study and exploration of history, literature, sociology, politics, and the arts, using technology as a means of recovery, healing, and knowledge production. Collaborating with communities to gather stories of past and present that have shaped their lived experiences can potentially have a healing effect, where residents find new meaning and a sense of purpose in preserving local history. Working class and elder members of longstanding Black communities face imminent displacement due to gentrification, which brings with it increased taxes and rent, making it near impossible to live in communities that are now becoming safer, more pedestrian friendly, with more food options and amenities. Now that inner cities are becoming attractive to millennials and Gen Zers who detest suburban life and commuting, Black residents who held on to property in what were once considered slums are finding it difficult to maintain and may be forced to abandon their beloved neighborhoods at a time when they should now enjoy its newfound conveniences. Atlanta, Georgia, where Du Bois conducted over 2 decades of interdisciplinary research in the AUC, is facing such challenges and can benefit from Africana Digital Humanities, where the emphasis is placed on recovery, healing, and community collaboration, with technology being a means, not necessarily an end. Taking a cue from Du Bois, who pioneered the nation's most sophisticated quantitative research around race and the Black population, Africana DH can be vital in sustaining the history and integrity of communities whose residents and stories are rapidly being displaced. I'll close by saying Africana Studies and Digital Humanities combining into Africana Digital Humanities identifies the presence of a global African world with a shared historical experience that stems from slavery and colonialism that make up the African diaspora. This unique historical and cultural experience can now be seen in foodways, architecture, spirituality, language, and technology, which undergirds the significance of Africana DH in a local context. Africana Digital Humanities takes on a scholar activist posture, as did its Du Boisian forebears. It resists racism and seeks also to challenge traditional DH by acknowledging the communicative power of spirit as a technology. Africana DH seeks to offer insight into marginalization and displacement by addressing the issues of race, class, gender, and place in predominantly Black communities. And I'll stop, and I do have a slide of sources that inform some of this research. And oh, those are not my slides.
Can you go back? Michael, can you go back, please? Thank you. No, to the sources. One more.
Okay,
Right
those
there.
are the sources that informs this research. Also, if you go one slide before, yes, this we put on a Planet Deep South conference, and in that conference we had scholars come down to discuss digital humanities, speculative cultural productions, and Africanisms in the American Global South. And we partner with Spelman, Georgia Tech, the AUC Woodruff Library, and here you have Ruha Benjamin. She's doing the keynote at Spelman. This is right before, this is in February 2020. So we'll continue with the conference in the future, possibly 2023. And I'll end there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. This is our space. This is the Center for Africana Digital Humanities. This is in Sage, Bacote, room 203.
Wonderful. Look forward to future partnerships with the center.
Yes, yes.
Great,
Looking
great, awesome. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Justin De La Cruz, and he's going to talk to us about Wikipedia, big data, and bots.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So Wikipedia is a large open data set of people sharing all kinds of information. The English language version is up to about 20 gigabytes with over 6 million individual entries. And Wikipedia saves every edit that's done on every article on the site. So in addition to looking where the gaps in knowledge are, we can see how many different users and bots edit a single article. And we can see all of the older versions of each article, which lets us investigate the entire history of Wikipedia. So we can look at any entry at any point in time, see when specific information was posted or deleted, and in what context. Next slide, please. Since all of the data is openly available, you can download all 20 gigabytes of the English language version or other language versions if you want. Or alternatively, you can use coding to access the information. You can use a Wikipedia library in Python to search and scrape some information from the site, or you can use a robust Wikipedia API to download specific portions of Wikipedia's entries based on your areas of interest. So for example, on the left here, I use Python to find all the Wikipedia articles with autism in the title. And then on the right, I use the API to download the 5 most recent article versions of the Andrew Wakefield entry. And you can get very specific with this. So you can download entries from a specific time span or from specific users or whatever you want. So you can search terms across Wikipedia as they appear currently and also throughout Wikipedia's history. It's all just a matter of using the scripts and the API to hone your searches and grab exactly what you need from the site. Next slide. So once you've downloaded everything you want to investigate, you can use any number of tools and approaches to analyzing the data. I just threw some up here, including Voyant at the top, and just a list of others. But you can see that there's a lot of tools available to us for language processing. And analyzing text can be called text mining in digital humanities, or it can be called natural language processing in computer science. But the basic idea is that you're trying to make sense of a whole bunch of text that you downloaded based on your research question and which frameworks you want to apply. So on the next slide, I'll talk about one project that I started recently, was looking into how public health information is conveyed on Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is one of the most heavily trafficked websites in the world. And since the information in the site is copied and pasted into other places, including Google results, and since many people, for better or for worse, routinely turn to Wikipedia for their information needs, I think it's really important to understand how information is conveyed on the site, and especially how matters of public health are represented on Wikipedia. One topic that got me started on this research was the spurious link between vaccines and incidence of autism that was widely discussed in popular culture for years, based mainly on this single academic study on the right, which had a very small sample size of 12 children. And the study was retracted, but it was retracted only after a decade after it was published. So now I can go through all the articles on autism and vaccines and any other related topics, and I can see what impact this study had on Wikipedia and how information was represented there. and see when that information was posted and when it was debunked or deleted or otherwise represented on Wikipedia. Next slide. So I think everyone should consider Wikipedia to be one giant source for data science projects. It's just a huge data set. There's a lot of information there across fields and a lot of people interacting with it. So in addition to analyzing the information it has and downloading portions of it, you can actually write scripts and build automatic bots to systematically process information and process edits on Wikipedia. So you can be updating Wikipedia without even being logged in. You have your bot doing it for you. So bots actually account for thousands of edits on Wikipedia, and they flag entries for various reasons. They flag word usage and grammar. They might point out photographs and content that don't align with best practices. And there's so many bots on the site that sometimes the bots will get in little wars with each other, and they'll actually fight each other on certain entries, constantly updating what other bots have just updated based on how their creators both coded them to behave. So I just wanted to say that Wikipedia has information on nearly every field of study. Millions of people are looking at it. And so investigating how people crowdsource that information and how people use that information could have a huge impact in multiple areas and multiple fields, including in public health. So feel free to reach out if you're interested in working in this area, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so very much. Somebody put in the chat, can we get the sources from the last presentation? I think that was Dr. Chapman. We invite all of our presenters, if you so choose, you can upload a PDF version of your presentation in the Hova platform, and then the participants can access those. So we put that out as an invitation. Our next speaker is Dr. Tammy Greer, who's going to talk to us about data informing social movements. Dr. Greer?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I appreciate you all. You can go to the next slide. So I am very interested in whether or not policy has changed based on protesting and the movements and the movements of social groups, social movements and interest groups to determine whether or not their activities have actually impacted policy. So when we look at different interest groups, not only over the course of the last 10 years or so, particularly around police incidences with civilians. We also think about other protest movements, environmental in the Keystone Pipeline in the Dakotas, and Native Americans, and other groups that have been impacted based on various types of policies. So my research is I am interested in determining or trying to see if there's a relationship between the strategies that individual interest groups develop, how they implement those particular strategies, and whether or not they are purposeful in their activities in order to influence policy, not only on the state level, also on the federal level. So if you can go to the next slide. So what am I looking to do? I'm looking to look at social movements, looking at it from a longitudinal standpoint. Some of them, I will take a look at interest groups that have been in existence for quite some time. So I can look as far back as, the KKK to the NAACP to the NRA, and all the way through to modern social movements that have arisen, let's say in the past 20 years or so. And to determine, not to necessarily to compare a newer interest group with one that has been existing for quite some time, not to compare them in terms of who's better, just to see those strategies and those methods that those more tenured interest groups, what they have developed over the course of their existence, and to look at the strategies of newer interest groups, not the tactics. Let's have to be clear, it's not the tactical methods of the interest groups of today, or to compare that with the tactical methods of those that have existed for quite some time. I'm looking at whether or not the methods to which they use the overall strategies to determine the effectiveness of the particular interest groups. The why, what, and how policy has changed over the course of the different interest groups. Have they been able to move to get legislative gains? Have those legislative gains been continuous? Have they been able to sustain some of their legislative gains, whether those gains have been in order for the group itself to thrive, or has it been oppressive in any manner to another group, to which it still becomes a legislative gain for the particular interest group that is pushing for the work that they're doing. So this will entail me looking at policies that are affiliated with or have been co-sponsored by, or interest groups that have had some type of influence on leaders, and to see those policies that have been pushing forward, and then it becomes so ingrained in the country that those policies themselves don't tend to move, they tend to stay. Next slide, please. And so when we look at overall, part of to the end goal is to see, number one, the proactiveness of some of the interest groups thus far, the ones that have obtained legislative gains and continue to obtain those legislative gains tend to do so from a proactive standpoint. So this will help particularly newer interest groups who are not effective to become effective, perhaps by being proactive instead of reactive in their methods. Also, obviously, it has to be some sort of a strategy. Sometimes those strategies may be obvious to the everyday person. Sometimes it's a long game. It's a game of chess, not 5 minute, but long-term chess, where the individual interest groups are able to continue to move forward with whatever strategies and long-term legislative gains that they're interested in. So that's what I want to do. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Greer. Next up, we have Dr. Teri Platt, who's going to talk to us about a data story, health and political engagement among African Americans. Dr.
Thank
Platt?
you. Thank you. While there is recognition among scholars that individual health has implications for political behavior, data-driven research and analysis of the relationships between political engagement and health outcomes has gained momentum given the overlap of the 2020 general election and the global COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, next slide, please. Social health determinants identify areas of health policy overlap that can be impacted by political participation in electoral outcomes. My research agenda explores the crossover effects of self-efficacy for political engagement and improved health outcomes. I'm trying to develop a data story, actually. So points of inquiry evaluate political consequences of improved health, specifically for African Americans, and health outcomes associated with feelings of efficacy and demonstrations of political efficacy through various forms of political engagement like voting, writing politicians, issue advocacy, and participating in rallies and marches. Additionally, understanding the relationship between health outcomes and political engagement for African Americans advances research and approaches for improving internal and external efficacy, which can have larger positive health effects. Next slide, please. Key indicators of overall health for African Americans, and specifically mortality rates, show that high blood pressure, diabetes, strokes, and other instances like cancer are directly impacting the African American voter age population. Every untimely death is the loss of a potential voter and voice in our political and policy processes. Additionally, while some studies demonstrate that those who experience diminished health are less likely to participate through voting because of physical and procedural barriers to casting a ballot, other studies demonstrate that those who experience certain cancers and other health crises where demonstrations of individual health self-efficacy is relatively high have a tendency to engage in non-electoral political and civic activities at rates higher than the average for the study populations. Clearly, more work is needed to understand what this may mean for African American health and electoral participation. A public health framework for reducing health inequalities and inequities, like the one developed by the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, illustrates variables and potential variable relationships that can structure our understanding of how issues of policy concern that are social determinants of health can impact African American mortality. In this instance, we can see how macro systems like society, communities, and larger systems affect microsystems such as individual choices, conditions, behaviors, and outcomes. So let's take a look at some data and variable relationships. When we take a look at key facts about African American eligible voters in 2020 battleground states using Pew Research Center analysis of American Community Survey data and data collected by Pew in 2020, we can see in Georgia that the state's 2.4 million Black eligible voters make up 32% of the electorate, the highest share among the 9 battleground states. From 2000 to 2018, the share of Black eligible voters increased by 5 percentage points in Georgia, the largest percentage point increase out of any of the battleground states. Across many of these battleground states, a majority of Black eligible voters live in the top 3 largest metropolitan areas in the state, areas that reflect the public health framework previously shown or currently shown. In Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, a large majority of Black eligible voters live in each state's largest metro areas. In Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, Black eligible voters are even more evenly distributed across several metropolitan areas. When we think about some of the issues that impact the Black lived experience in metropolitan areas, we must pay attention to variables like poverty and health insurance coverage among Black eligible voters, which can vary in these swing states. Florida, Georgia, and Iowa have the highest share of Black eligible voters without health insurance, which was at 18%. Meanwhile, the Black electorate in all 9 states had uninsured rates that are equal to or exceeded the U.S. electorate overall, which was 8%. All of these exceeded the share of those living in poverty among all Black eligible voters, which was 19%, and the U.S. eligible voters overall, which was 11%. The uninsured and poverty rates of Black eligible voters reflected the national and ethnic disparities that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 outbreak. In nearly every state, Black Americans have accounted for a disproportionately higher rate of COVID-19 deaths and have also experienced widespread economic hardships. The reality is that many of these issues have had an impact on feelings of self-efficacy, trust in government, adherence to health protocols, and overall health outcomes. Another survey by Pew conducted in the month of September 2020 found that Black adults are more hesitant to trust medical scientists to get vaccinated for COVID-19 if a vaccine is available, when it becomes available, and now that it is available. I look forward to exploring these variables and the relationships more over the summer and through an examination of the American Community Survey data and of 2020 American National Election Study data, noting that the data that's currently available is the preliminary pre and post-election data. And I look forward to further developing this data story because I really believe it has major implications for how we engage our population around issues of policy. It has implications for how we mobilize voters for our upcoming election and how we're able to promote overall policy health, public health in potentially vulnerable communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Platt. Our next speaker is Dr. Emeline Renz. who's going to talk about mapping Black America, Geographic Data Science. Dr. Renz?
Thank you. I'll correct you and just clarify that I'm not a doctor, but I'm working on it. And I'll talk a little bit about my research. I chose to focus instead on the project that I started and continue to support here at the AUC rather than my research. But if I have a little bit of time, and I know we're running a little bit behind, but if I do have a little bit of time, I'll speak to that. I'm inspired, my title I changed a little bit, inspired by titles from the souls of Black folks, in which W.E.B. Du Bois said that education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. And so we wanted to make sure that students are understanding that, you know, these projects are not just for science, they are for them. Next slide, please. In Du Bois Data Portraits from the 1900 Paris exhibition, he included charts and graphics that visualized the Black population in the United States at the time. And I think Du Bois realized that data visualization is essential to not only understanding data and understanding data science, but also the public's the audience's understanding, how other people receive this information and how they can process it. Not only were Du Bois's maps relevant to the work that he was doing at the time, but they're relevant to work that's being done today. In fact, they're still using his maps to compare those times in Philadelphia's 7th Ward to current times. Next slide, please. Geography is essential because it helps center our audience, the people who are receiving our information, in place. We can use data from various sources, the American Community Survey, the CDC, HUD, and other sources, even Wikipedia, to overlay and assess that information with other variables. One of the key components that geography can tell us that no other data science can tell us is whether people have access to the resources, the goods and services that they need, such as healthcare, such as political voting locations, such as places where they can gather for political protests. And finally, maps. Maps are a critical component of visualizing data. The data that we've processed, maps put our audience in place. It helps the audience understand issues such as concentrated poverty, public health outcomes, as Dr. Platt discussed, disseminating information in political protests, as Dr. Greer assessed, and even engaging equity and inequality. Next slide, please. So adding perspective to access, we can understand finding patterns, looking at relationships between crime and income at a very intrinsic level that lets people see themselves in a place like Chicago. We can understand relationships between otherwise seemingly disparate data, such as Black versus white populations and which particular grocery store chains are opening in those areas. We can determine new locations, such as adding abortion clinics in Mississippi that currently only has one abortion clinic, and then making predictions. Does crime impact home values in Atlanta, or maybe it's the other way around? The maps you see before you weren't created by me, they were created by professionals. They were created by students at Clark Atlanta University. Next slide, please. These students are challenged to understand these questions in Intro to GIS. This is CSCJ 350, taught in the Du Bois Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. In Introduction to Geographic Information Systems, students are challenged to apply these GIS fundamentals to self-selected projects that interest them, projects that work within their field, and leverage that visualization and those visualization tools to tell a story. Students from that class can then take on that information into the applied GIS class. The core of the class was built around collecting campus features to create map layers under the direction of campus administrators. But this class has also been leveraged as a way to do an independent project, working from the project from CSCJ 350. You can learn more about these student projects at caugis.maps.arcgis.com. And if I have one moment, I'll speak to my current research, which is I'm still working on the data, right? Data cleaning the 311 data from Atlanta to see where disparities are happening in reports of 311, access to services, and response times to services, as well as the intersection of political and voting behaviors, as well as home values. And that's it. I'll try to keep it short, so hopefully that covers it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Renz, who will soon be Dr. Renz. I'm just calling your future.
Soon to be Dr. Renz. Fingers crossed. A couple more years, but I'll
I see it all mapped out.